Hi there. My name is Dr. Julia Guseva. I'm a writer and a college professor. And today we'll talk about outlines for fiction. A lot of my students tell me that they start a story and then they don't know how to finish. And that could be very frustrating. So one suggestion I have to solve that problem is to write an outline, but not one of those boring outlines that you may remember from your high school or middle school days, but an outline that's specifically designed for fiction and for various aspects of fiction. So in today's lesson, we'll talk about 7 steps that you can take to help yourself write an outline. And think of this outline like a roadmap. You don't have to follow it exactly, but it can help guide you, and it also allows for detours and other adventures along the way. So let's go on and talk about the first step on this outline, which is called craft your premise. So our first step is crafting your premise. And you may ask, what's a premise? A premise is the basic idea for a story. But some students or some beginning writers make this premise too general or too basic. Like a girl wants to find herself, or a boy wants to go on an adventure. That's a little bit too basic, and it doesn't have enough details. It doesn't allow you to develop your story. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, who is your protagonist? And don't just say it's a girl or a boy or it's Mary. Give it a little bit more details. Try to explain to yourself who your protagonist is, right? Maybe a little bit of personal history, maybe a little bit of personality, age, looks, things like that. Then the second question is, what is the situation? And more specifically, what is the protagonist's goal or problem or desire or objective? If your protagonist is happy and nothing is happening to him or her, then there's no reason for the story, right? So your protagonist needs a reason to start the plot going. And that reason is the desire or the goal or a problem that the character is going to overcome. So you're going to describe that situation. You're going to describe this objective, and it's not interesting if your protagonist has a goal and right away accomplishes that goal. We need to have some kind of opposition, and opposition doesn't mean that there's an enemy or a villain who is in the way. It could be, but it could be other things. It could be an act of nature. Let's say your protagonist wants to, I don't know, maybe move across the country and there's a hurricane or there's a flood. So then this natural event will be the problem on the way, the obstacle on the way to accomplishing his or her goals, right? Or it could be him or herself. You probably know the expression, we are our own worst enemies sometimes. So we prevent ourselves from accomplishing our goals. So that could be a possibility for your story too. Or it could be an antagonist, an actual person who wants to prevent your character from accomplishing his or her goals. And this antagonist could also be a well-wisher. You know how sometimes people want to help us so much that they make us helpless? So that could be an interesting conflict in your story too. So then you can think about the ending. How will the story end? And generally, there are 3 possible ways to end. Your character will accomplish the goal right at the end. The character will fail to accomplish the goal, or the character will change his or her mind and maybe set a different goal. So you have the beginning, you have the end, and now you have to think about what will happen in the way. How will this conflict develop? What can you do to increase the tension? And how can you avoid making the middle of your story boring? And we'll talk about it in the next segment. So now that you have a general idea of how you want your story to start and end, and maybe a little bit about the middle, we can talk about scenes in your story. So what is a scene? In fiction, we use the word scene not in the same meaning as we use it in real life. In real life, we'll sometimes say, oh, look at the beautiful scene. And we just mean scenery, right? In a story, a scene is a building block of that story. So what is a scene? A scene will have a certain cast of characters. Maybe, let's say, at the beginning, you just have your protagonist and the protagonist's friend, right? So we have 2 characters. So then what else does a scene need? A scene needs a specific setting. So ask yourself, where are my characters? Maybe my protagonist and his or her friend are sitting outside, and then I can describe the setting a little bit. It's maybe a warm summer evening, and they're sitting there watching the sunset, right? So we have the setting, we have the characters, and now we need to have the reason for the scene. And the beginning scene should introduce a problem. Maybe the protagonist says to his or her friend, I am really bored in this town, and I feel like my life is passing me by. I need to go on an adventure, right? Or some other problem, goal, or desire. So already we know that things will change in the next scene, right? So the scene can be defined as a building block of a story when you have a certain set of characters in a certain setting, and that scene has a specific purpose in your story. And that's a building block of your plot, right? So during this step of your outlining process, outline different scenes. So think about where the story is taking place, right? Each of the scenes. Think about when it's taking place, and think about who the characters are in each scene. And most importantly, think about the purpose for each scene. You don't want to have a scene where your characters are just, I don't know, playing checkers or drinking tea, and there's no reason for that scene. Each scene needs to advance the plot by either revealing something new, resolving a part of a conflict, introducing a new conflict, or doing something else that will help you develop the story, right? So this step is sketching out your scenes. So think about that, take a little break, and then we'll talk about the next step in your outlining process. All right, so now that you have an idea of what scenes you want to include in the story, your next step is to interview your characters. And I think that's a really fun step. If you've never tried it before, I definitely suggest that you try it and see how it works out for you. And I'll link a few really fun character questionnaires below. But before you look at these other questionnaires and at these more detailed questions, let's think about the reason. Why would you need to do that? So think about the beginning of your story and that problem that the characters are facing. In my example, I said that maybe the character is bored and this character wants to explore life outside their town. So let's think about that. What led your character to this conclusion? You don't need to include this in your story, but you as a writer need to know that. So why suddenly this character is bored? Maybe it's not so sudden. What is it in his or her past that led him to this conclusion? Maybe you can think about this character's relationships with other characters. Maybe you can think about the family's background. Maybe this character met somebody who just came from a big adventure, and that's what makes the character think that he or she wants this adventure. Maybe the character is getting older and feels, well, if I don't go on an adventure now, I will never do that. So then you can think about, well, what prevented this character from adventures before? Was it their own fears? Was it maybe some obligations they had to fulfill? And what changed now? So by asking all these questions, you can learn a lot about your characters, and that will help you develop more scenes. It will help you develop realistic scenes because you know who your characters are as real people. And you do need to think about them as real people because that's the only way for your readers to connect to your characters. And again, you don't feel like you have to include all this information in the story. Most of it will be just for you so that you know how to develop the rest of your story, and so that you will know how your character is likely to react to certain events, right? So think about that, answer a few of these questions, maybe write a few of these character sketches, and then we'll talk about the next step in your outlining process. All right, so the next step in your story writing process is looking at your settings and sketching out the main settings that you need. I remember a little bit earlier we talked about the main scenes, right? Key scenes in your story. So think about settings that you need for those key scenes. And if you're writing a short story, well, actually, if you're writing a novel, it's still the same. When you look at your key scenes, try to limit your number of settings. And let me explain what I mean. For example, in real life, if you are leaving home to go to work, for example, then the first setting is maybe your bedroom, then maybe it's your kitchen, then maybe it's your garage, then you're driving, then you're in the parking lot, and so on, right? So a lot of different settings. And a lot of times when beginning writers start writing, they try to describe all these settings in detail. And that slows the pace of the story. And it's just not necessary. We know that when people get to work, we can assume that, they get up in the morning, they somehow get to their car, they somehow drive and then get to their office. So what are the key scenes? And match these key scenes to those key settings. Maybe in the morning they get a phone call, and while they're taking this phone call, maybe they're in the kitchen. Maybe that could be your first scene, right? And then the next scene is what? You don't need to show how they're walking outside, because then you have to describe what outside feels like, right? Maybe the next scene, you can just cut to when they got to work and then get the next scene going, right? So you can skip a lot of these unnecessary settings where no key events take place. So when you sketch out your settings, think about these settings in terms of key scenes, and think about of condensing settings. So if nothing significant happens in the setting, you don't need to have that. Or if maybe there's a significant conversation that took place in the hallway, and then something else happened inside the office building, well, maybe you could combine those settings. Why combine? Because that will eliminate the need for extra descriptions. And descriptions, even though they're important, they tend to slow down the pace of your story. And a lot of times these descriptions are not needed, especially if you cut the settings that you're trying to describe. So take a look at that. Take a look at your settings and how they relate to your key scenes. And then we'll take a look at the next step. All right, so now you have your key scenes, your key settings, you have your characters. So now we're getting to a more exciting part. And at this point, we're going to look at each of your scenes, and we're going to ask certain questions about that scene. And at this point, I'd suggest writing a little sentence summarizing each scene. That way you can see how the story is progressing without describing too many details. And then you'll be able to ask yourself if all those scenes are necessary and what the purpose of each scene is. So let me give you an example. You could write an outline just as one sentence, like this one. Dana meets Joe at a cafe to discuss their upcoming wedding, right? So you have the two characters, you have the purpose of the scene, and you have the setting. You don't need to describe the setting, right, in your outline. You can do it later. For now, you're just getting the main turning points. You can also make this description a little bit more detailed and suggest a specific conflict, like this one. Joe's sitting by himself in a booth when Dana arrives. Dana orders coffee and a muffin. They fight about the invitation list. Right? So a little bit more specific. So it's not just a cafe, it's a booth, and she's ordering something and they have a certain conflict. You can do it either way, of course, or in some other way that works for you. But I think what's important is in each of these sentences or little summaries to ask yourself questions like these ones. You can start is who will be your narrating character or your point of view character? In other words, from whose point of view? Are you telling Joe's side of the story in this case, or Dana's side of the story? Who is going to be your main character in that scene? The second question you're going to ask is, what is this character's goal? Right? So you're helping your readers relate to that point of view character, showing who that person is. Now you're stating the goal. And then think about what kind of obstacles will arise on the way to that goal, and how will these obstacles create conflict. Remember how we talked about earlier? You need each scene to have conflict. They can't just meet in a cafe and have a nice lunch and then say goodbye. Something needs to be in conflict. And of course, what will be the outcome of the conflict, right? That's important. And one part that I notice a lot of my students forget to do is, how will your character react to this conflict and to the outcome of this conflict? A lot of times, first drafts are, well, everything exploded and my character went home. Well, wait a second. What do you mean he went home? How did he react to these explosions? Physically, mentally, emotionally? That's important to include. And what decision will or what outcome of that scene would you want to see, so that you can transition to the next scene, right? You can think about scenes as building blocks of your story, and you can think that each scene has an action, and each action has a consequence, right? And that consequence will be shown in the following scene, and so on until you get to the end of your story. So again, your goal here is to write your complete outline by sketching out a little summary for each scene and using the questions that I mentioned to you. So take a look at that, and then we'll discuss the next step. So depending on how many details you put in your previous outline, you may need or may not need this next step. And also depending on how long, what kind of project you have, if it's a short story or if it's a novel. So this next step, I call that condensing your outline. So in the previous step, you had a lot of details probably, right? With the scenes and the conflict and things like that. If your story is long and if you're finding that you're getting a hard time kind of getting lost in all these details, what you can do is maybe write just a sentence for each of those key scenes. Or what you could do is maybe put it on index cards and have kind of a name of a scene and then details later. You can also do it, of course, in the word processor. If you're doing it in a Word document, for example, you could do headings in your document, and each heading will correspond to a brief summary of the scene. And then you can see, looking at this outline, this abbreviated outline, you can see what your main scenes are, and you can decide if you have too many characters, if you can combine some characters, if you can combine some settings, if any of these scenes are not really needed. So all of this, sometimes it's easier to do, especially if you're writing longer work in a condensed form of the outline, right? So take a few minutes, or maybe longer than a few minutes, take a little pause, work on that, and then we'll talk about the last step. So the next step is the most exciting one. So finally, you're done with your outline, done with all the sketching things out, and now you can finally start writing. And the great thing about outlines is that if you don't feel like starting with your opening scene, you can pick a different scene and even start in the middle, because you do know the structure of your story. And sometimes it's easier to get into the story by starting with maybe the moment that seems the most exciting to you in your story, right? Another benefit of outlines is if you're busy, and of course I know most of you are busy, you don't just sit around all day writing stories, you have a lot of other things to do. And in our busy lives, it's easy to kind of forget the bigger picture of the novel or of the story. But if you have your outline, you can always refresh your memory just in a few minutes by looking at this outline. And I would suggest when you start writing, especially if you write sequentially, and for most people, sequential writing, probably especially after, you could start with the first couple of scenes from the middle, but then eventually it is better to write sequentially. So as you write each of your next scenes, take a look at the previous scene, take a look at the upcoming scene, so that your story flows a little bit better. And again, like we talked about at the beginning, your outline is your roadmap. So if a new idea comes to mind, if inspiration strikes and you want to do something different, like you could on a road trip, go ahead and do that. Road trip or roadmap doesn't mean you have to follow all your stops, right? You don't have to follow your whole outline, but you do have it, and you can definitely deviate from it and see where your imagination takes you. So good luck with your project. I hope this little lesson was helpful to you, and good luck with your stories.